Welcome to the Writers League of Texas podcast, conversations and presentations featuring writers and industry professionals talking about the craft and business of writing. More information about this discussion, including details on our panelists and presenters, can be found at writersleague.org. We hope you enjoy the discussion.
Tonight's panel is writing about myth, and it started off as a panel thinking about like ancient myth, but you can't live in a place like Texas and think about myth and not begin to think of some more recent mythologizing that has happened. There's an old building down the road in San Antonio that probably, if you grew up in Texas, you wouldn't visited in school. And so we began thinking, like, what are more sort of recent or more American myths that we might talk about as well? And so you're going to see in our panelists that we have a wide variety of takes on myth tonight, and it's going to be a great conversation. So thank you for being here. I'll go ahead and jump into introductions. To my left is Sheila Black. She is the author of 2 full-length poetry collections, House of Bone and Love, Iraq, and 2 chapbooks, How to Be a Maculadora and Continental Drift, with painter Michelle Marceau. Her collection, Wing Croy, received the 2011 Orphic Prize in Poetry, and she was a 2012 Witter Benner Fellow in Poetry, selected by U.S. Poet Laureate Philip Levine, and she is also Executive Director of Gemini Inc. in San Antonio. Please give a warm welcome to Sheila. Dr. Helena Woodard is an Associate Professor of English and a faculty member of the John L. Warfield Center for African and African American Studies here at the University of Texas at Austin. Her recent publications include African British Writers, Champions of Freedom, Equiano, Enslavement, Resistance, and Abolition, Troubling the Archives, Reconstituting the Slave Subject and Revisiting Slave Narratives, and Reading the Two Marys, Prince and Shelley, on the textual meeting ground of race, gender, and genre, and in Tennessee Studies and Literature. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Woodard. P.J. Hoover first fell in love with Greek mythology in 6th grade thanks to the book Mythology by Edith Hamilton. After a 15-year bout as an electrical engineer designing computer chips for a living, P.J. decided to take her own stab at mythology and started writing books for kids and teens. She has since published the Forgotten Worlds trilogy, the YA novel Solstice, Tut, The Story of My Immortal Life, a pick for the 2015 Texas Lone Star list, and its sequel, Tut, My Epic Battle to Save the World. Please welcome PJ. And Dr. Richard R. Flores is Senior Associate Dean for Academic Affairs for the College of Liberal Arts and Professor of Anthropology and Mexican American Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, where he holds the C.B. Smith Senior Centennial Chair in U.S.-Mexico Relations. He works in the areas of critical theory, performance studies, semiotics, and historical and cultural anthropology. He's the author of Remembering the Alamo, Memory, Modernity, and the Master Symbol, Los Pastores, History and Performance in the Mexican Shepherd's Play of South Texas, and editor of Adina de Zavala's History and Legends of the Alamo. In addition to his scholarly work, he oversees UTeach, Liberal Arts, the college's secondary teacher preparation program in social studies, English, and foreign languages, and the Muslim Histories and Cultures program, an education program for the high school social studies teachers. And he has developed the college's new effort in international studies, the Global Initiative for Education and Leadership. Please welcome Dr. Flores. So I thought we would begin with a kind of basic question, but one that I think makes sense given like the panelists' sort of like very vast backgrounds and subject matters that you work with, and that is, what is myth? What is the thing that we're talking about? Because like we all sort of have a general understanding of like the word, but like there's also like popular usages of it, right? I mean, there's a show called Mythbusters that's not really about myth like we would normally think about it. There are people who like to say that like global warming is a myth, and that's an entirely different kind of usage. And so I guess I thought, PJ, I'll start with you because you're working with what is probably like what we most sort of immediately think of as myth, like Greek and Egyptian mythology. And you also you write for children, so this is probably a question that you have to like answer. what is myth? What are we talking about?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. I can't wait to hear what everybody else says about this also, because it's something I think about a lot. But, I do a lot of school visits. I go visit kids from mostly third grade and up, but sometimes even younger than that. And, my books focus on mythology, and it's natural for me. I've always loved mythology, so it's just something that I don't even have to think about, except when kids are like giving me this blank stares when I start mentioning mythology. They're like, and I'm like, okay, raise your hand if you know what mythology is. And maybe like 2 hands go up when you're talking to the third graders and the rest don't. And so I try to describe it very loosely to kids when I describe it, which is I say, thousands of years ago, people didn't know why the sun rose in the east and set in the west, and they didn't know why we had summer, winter, spring, and fall, and they didn't know many different things, and they came up with different stories for why these things happened, and those stories became their mythology. And now maybe we have answers to a lot of those questions, but there are answers or questions that we don't have the answers to, and those are the kind of things that would make up our mythology too. So that's kind of what I say in my description.
And then. Sheila, we were just off stage. We were just talking about this very question, and you said, "Oh, I sometimes sort of draw distinctions between myth and mythologizing," and I wonder if you could explain that.
Well, I really think of a myth as you said, PJ, it's a story about something we don't understand. But I also think that myths are stories that have mysteries at the heart of them. I think that one reason we stay attached to myth and fairy tale is, for a story that's supposed to explain something like why there's summer or winter, myths and fairy tales are remarkable as stories because they have almost no psychological explanation. They tend to have a very compressed tone where miraculous things and ordinary things happen and they're sort of described in the same way. So I think that makes them always we encounter them as if they're fresh for the first time, because there's always a mystery at the heart of that story. Why did Persephone eat 6 seeds? Why did Hades grab her in the first place? And there's always some little detail, usually in a myth, often an image that's suggestive, like those 6 pomegranate seeds, but we can't really pin down exactly what it means. It kind of opens the door for us to kind of think about the question of meaning and about those mysteries we don't have answers for.
And Richard, I guess that sort of leads to your work, which is less about sort of myth in that sense and much more about mythologizing. In your book, Remembering the Alamo, which sort of begins to tease apart the way that the narrative about the Alamo that most of us have probably encountered at one point or another, the way it's put together and sort of the messages it conveys. You use very early on the term cultural memory. It's a site of cultural memory. And I wonder if you could explain a bit about what that means generally as a term and how it relates to mythologizing and historical narratives and discourse.
When I use cultural memory, it actually ties in quite well with what PJ and Sheila said. When I think of myth, I think of a sense-making mechanism, or a sense-making story or narrative. And cultural memory is about that. And the way I use it in the book is to articulate how a physical place begins to embody multiple narratives of, in this case, identity, or identities, I should say, because it's not just one identity. And so at the heart of what I'm trying to get at in the book is the way the Alamo gets constructed later, much later, after 1836. So just briefly, the battle takes place in 1836, and what gets known as a sacred place and a sacred shrine doesn't happen until beginning in the 1890s. So why is that? You would think if it was a sacred place or sacred ground, it would happen almost right away, like what happened at Gettysburg. But that's not what happens here. So it gets reconstructed, retold, reinvested with particular kinds of meanings that are very particular to that era. And that's what I try to unpack. So cultural memory is really the way in which places or locations or sites get invested with kinds of memory and embody those in ways that just the image itself recalls them.
And then Helena, I'm going to cheat too because we were talking before the panel, and you have studied and done a lot of work with like slave narratives, slavery narratives, and in particular, you've done a lot of work with like Toni Morrison's work. And you said something earlier that I thought was fascinating, which is we were talking about different books that Morrison has written, and you said other critics have said like, well, she's changed her narrative or changed her view about slavery. And I think that's like of course, we're in the midst of like conversations about how we think about slavery and the Civil War. And I wonder about these sort of seminal narratives, these literary novels that have come down to us. The idea that the story, even from somebody like Morrison, shifts and changes.
Yes, Morrison is known, of course, for the seminal novel Beloved, for which she won the Pulitzer Prize. It was 1987. But she published as her 11th novel, Mercy, which predates Beloved. Beloved set in the 1850s, and Mercy is set in the 1600s or the 17th century. And Morrison was stirred to write that novel by an incident known as Bacon's Rebellion, in which a group of individuals that included enslaved Africans in the colonies, in the U.S., Indians, American Indians, poor English, whites who were indentured servants, couples that were interracially married at the time, Africans and English women, because their situation was more class-based than race-based. But they got together and formed and fought the English who governed the colonies at the time prior to 1776 War for Independence. And the colonists felt they were mistreated, which they were, paid poorly. If you were an indentured servant, you worked for 7 years and then you would go free. But if the planter would find, if your parent died, say you died and you had a child, that child would be forced to work out the remainder of your indenturehood. And that was a law made up, sort of like English common law, made up as they went along. And the colonists had no way to fight these injustices or infractions like breaking tools or mouthing off, and let alone running away. Also meant more years would be just arbitrarily added onto your sentence. So these individuals regarded as proletarians, they were poor, and got together and formed a rebellion, Bacon's Rebellion. And they actually achieved quite a bit, but they were eventually overtaken by the English militia and punished with laws that mostly affected the enslaved Africans. They could no longer, for instance, own property independently, could no longer marry interracially. African women, enslaved black women, the children of these women had to take, all women, had to take the status of the mother. So if she's black and enslaved, then their child, regardless of biraciality or what have you, would take that status as well. And Morrison's concerned and interested in a time in which a diverse coalition in society came together to fight for their human rights. And why it happened at that period. I look at myth through Morrison's writings from the concept of misconceptions and mythologies. And so here, the mythology is that Africans arrived in what was the New World, America, in 1619, the first 20. They were indentured. They had the same status as the white English and were freed upon 7 years of service. Within 20 years, that policy had radically shifted through the case known as the John Punch case of 1640, when a black indentured servant ran away with 2 white servants for abuse by their planter. And when they were caught and returned, the 2 white, this is absolutely true, I've read the law, the legal statute, Irishmen and Scotchmen were given an extra year onto their terms of indenturehood for running away because the judge found that they were culpable. But John Punch, the black servant who ran away with them, was sentenced to serve the remainder of his life as a slave. He is legally the first legal chattel slave in America. And that's very little known about. But that shows that within a short period of time, a couple of decades, the law started to shift away from a coalition of diverse individuals who shared poverty, not race, diverse in gender, diverse in ethnicity, if you will, suddenly being codified into categories. And that category led to what's called the chattel enslavement of Africans in the U.S.
Sheila mentioned the Persephone myth, and that's actually sort of the myth at the heart of the novel Solstice that you wrote. And when I learned of that myth as a kid, the way that we most of us do, it was explanation of the seasons. Why is there summer and winter? And then I sort of revisited it recently because my oldest son is really into the Rick Riordan novels, and so we've gone through all of the mythology, the Greek mythology. And when I heard that story this time, I was like, wow, she just gets grabbed and taken away. That's a pretty awful story. And so it made me aware of like the many ways that one can view like one story, and this time I really identified with like the mother's sort of like sense of loss and like just her anger, which is part of your novel as well. And so I wonder, as you began to like think about this myth for a novel that's meant for why a novel like meant for kids, obviously you're not going to go into like the you're going to sort of deal less with like the capture and sort of the sort of darkness at the heart of it, perhaps, and deal with other aspects of it. How did you find a way to tell this story or reimagine this story in a way that like is going to like be really compelling and connect with like your readers?
It's a great question because Solstice is a book that's aimed at young adults, and young adults, one of the biggest things in young adult literature is the kids want to relate to the characters in the novel. Yeah, and you also want to not make Hades out to be like this bad guy from the very start. And so I love to play the what if game with mythology. What if Persephone didn't have the best mom in the world? What if her mom was really like crazy and was like, you can't have any friends. I don't want you talking to friends. I don't want you talking to boys. And Persephone is like, Mom, I'm a teenager. I want to hang out with my friends. I don't want to spend all my time with you. What if Persephone actually wanted to go to the underworld? What if she saw Hades and was like, hey, this Hades guy's kind of cute, and my mom told me he was like hideous and ugly, and if my mom lied about that, what else has my mom been lying to me about? And these are things that you can do, and the teens can relate directly to these. I remember feeling like my parents didn't let me do anything as a teen, and so we have in this Solstice, Persephone is just, suffocated by her mom's being so overprotective, and, teens want to branch out, and they see cute guys, and they don't always tell their mothers everything and stuff like that, and it's just those things really trying to relate right into our emotions. And it's one thing I love about myths is the emotions that we hear, from thousands of years ago are the emotions that we're feeling today. And it's just tapping into those, twisting them a little to meet your purpose. Like in my Tut book, if I may, the story goes that King Tut died when he was 19. And we don't really know how he died. It was probably like some genetic, disease or whatever. But of course, I want to play around with that too. And so I make him a 14-year-old immortal, character who's living in modern day Washington, D.C., who's actually kind of cute, and stuff like that. And so it's fun to do that. And that's just what I really love doing is taking those myths and twisting them around, however best suits me. So.
Harry Potter.
And, I'm curious too, so then, like when you think about these stories that you're writing, to what extent is like the myth at the center of the novel, and what extent is like the myth serving a story that is to some extent timeless, right? About like teenagers falling in love and figuring that out, and in Tut it's like a boy going through middle school, and so he's awkward as we all are in middle school.
Yeah, they say there's like 5 stories out there, and we just keep retelling them over and over and over again. So I think you're right. Like, the romance is at the core of a book like Solstice. It's romance and global warming. Funny enough, as you mentioned global warming at the beginning. But, Tut, it's like a story about revenge. He's trying to get revenge about, against his family being murdered, and he has to come to terms with this and with the loss of his family, even thousands of years later, and stuff like that. So I think for me, my biggest goal as an author is to have somebody read my book and enjoy it enough that they want to go off and Google some of the stuff and be like, hey, what really happened here? What's this? And do their own research and inspire them that way. And, as we work with kids in schools, curriculum is so key, so important. So tying into those curriculum themes that we learn about the hero's journey and the stories from mythology and things like that the kids are getting introduced to. So that's my goal. And at the end of Tut, there's an author's note, because there were so many differences between King Tut was 14 in my book and 19 in real life or whatever. And I don't want people to call me out on that and, be like, she's wrong, I know I'm wrong. I accept that, and that's intentional. But do your own research, seek it out on your own, and send me ideas. That's what I always say. Like, if you have a great idea, send it on to me. So,
take note. So Sheila, we're talking about the psychology of these characters, and I know that's something that in your work, when you make sort of references or allusions to mythological figures, it's very often to make a kind of emotive sort of point.
I had a great quote by Walter Benjamin here, actually. He said, half the art of storytelling is to keep a story free from explanation as one reproduces it. I think that's a beautiful idea. You don't want to, we all know that, show, don't tell. If you tell me too much, I won't care. But I'm really struck that when you read a myth, there's always room for you to interpret, and that's very important. At the same time, the older I get, the more all those myths and fairy tales seem almost unbearably psychologically accurate. Like the fairy tale, I'll give a few examples. The fairy tale of the goose girl, she's kidnapped by a mean servant. Her mother has given her 3 drops of blood in her handkerchief. The girl drops the drops of blood that keeps saying, listen to me, but the girl doesn't listen. She lets herself be enslaved. She can't bear to tell anybody her story. And the truth only comes out when she's locked in a room and the king is listening behind an old stove and she thinks she's talking to no one. I mean, that's just an example. You start to think about that story in adolescent girls today. I mean, the story is probably 900 years old, and it makes perfect sense, And it gives us images to start really pondering those psychological mysteries. And I think one reason myths last and fairy tales last, and is partly they're able to be changed to fit each generation, but partly because they tend, I'm trying to come back to your question, that I use them for psychologically extreme moments. We tend to need literature when we need to be consoled. And what we find consoling is not aspirational. It's not the kind of book or movie that says, wow, you could be living this perfect life over here. We enjoy those kind of things, but they don't speak to us, because we all know at some point we'll deal with things in life that are very difficult, right? And that we don't understand. We don't know why they're happening to us, like death or, not to be, big things. And that's when we need sort of the consolation of somebody else standing in front of that mystery. And I think for me, that's what myth kind of does.
I wonder, since you just mentioned, the difference between wisdom and interpretation and lived experience, there's a poem that you wrote, and I wonder if you would read it. It's not very long. The Dead is a poem, and I won't introduce the myth that's in it, but it's a myth that I'm pretty sure everyone here is familiar with.
Oh, yeah. Oh, gosh. I've never been asked to read this poem. It's always nice when somebody picks a poem of yours. You're like, ah. And it mentions a French poet, François Villon, who is a medieval poet. He wrote he was a thief, and he was eventually hanged, I think. And but while he was waiting to be hung, he wrote these great poems. And one's called the Petit Testament, the Small Testament, and then the Big Will, his Big Will. And he basically wrote a poem that was a will. All right. The Dead. Vion said, snows of last year, not yesteryear. The dirty secret of organic farming. The peach grower in the Willamette Valley told me the fish blood on the fields, the necessity of it, bone meal, the dried flakes of skin. If I could live with the notion of perfection, but like Tennyson, I keep wanting the you as you were, the gray patch in your hair, your need to keep drinking past the point when it was amusing. In a review of Milton, James Woods writes, the lovely thing is how Adam and Eve rescue themselves. Adam could have been immortal, forever in the garden, the glass-voiced God willing to press the rewind button, pluck another rib, forge an entirely new woman. Yet Adam chooses instead to wander, to be the mouth of dust, the footprint erased. And so nights I mourn the blood fields, the bones spread across like tiny cilia feeders. Thank you.
You know what I found so compelling about that is, of course, like when I heard the Adam and Eve story long ago, it was always conveying a particular message. That message changed depending on sort of like what denomination you grew up in or whatever. But and then like when I've encountered it in literature, it's almost always like a revision of that message. Like Ursula K. Le Guin's got a famous story called "She Names Them," and it's a sort of undoing a lot of the meaning of the original one. But that's not what you're after, though. You're after sort of like that lived experience, which is like what it might feel like to be Adam.
Yeah, but I'm really glad to have the myths to give me a skeleton to insert my lived experience. But no, I mean, I think that it's very interesting how we have positive and negative connotations with myth. And I think the positive one is that sort of mystery at the heart of identity, including cultural identity. But the negative one, which Helena was talking about so eloquently, is that we also tell stories that falsify identity. I mean, as groups and also as individuals. So that word myth is so charged for us, I think, because I think in some ways it's a very pure thing. This idea of a story that is powerful enough to, I don't know, I mean, part of what I feel about myth is when I read real fairy tales or Greek myths, there's always that slight, wow, like that slight goosebump feeling, Emily Dickinson talks about. Because there's always some detail in the myth or fairy tale I'm not expecting, I don't understand, that kind of shocks me. At the same time, myth, and I feel like right now in our country, this is a huge issue. Myth and mythologizing can also be this tremendous attempt to tell a story that either changes or controls reality in ways that can be, I might let Helena.
Oh, you're so right about that. And thinking again about Morrison in this context, coming from Edgewise, David Blight, who's a pretty noted historian at Yale, is among those who have talked about how the South recreated, or created, I guess I should say, the mythology around losing the Civil War. And we know now that there is controversy over statues being removed from government-located sites in many states, and it led to the awful violence of the night before last in Charlottesville, Virginia. And so that said, historians like Blight have charged that the South lost the war but won the ideology or won the peace because they used language such as lost cause ideology to change the narrative about slavery to this effect. Slavery was fine and the Black African slaves, the African captives were satisfied and happy in their roles. They were fed and taken care of by their masters until those bad old Yankees came down and started that Civil War and ruined everything. And so that mythology is also around the idea that some in the South, regard the war as the war between the states and not the Civil War, given precedence to the individuality of the states, and suggesting then that slavery had nothing to do with the Civil War, which of course is absolutely not true at all. And then last out of that mythological cavity, if you will, is when the slavery did not end with the Civil War, nor did it end with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution, because it was transformed into sharecropping, peonage, black codes, and other systems. The idea then that removing those statues is revising history or destroying history is not at all true. History has been distorted with the erection of those statues in the first place, especially at government-located sites.
Richard, this ties really closely into what you write about. And at the beginning of your book, in part 1, you quote another writer, Jacques Le Goff, and he writes, "But collective memory is not only a conquest, it is also an instrument and an objective of power." And that's.
I was just going to talk about power.
So go ahead, because that seems like, in a nutshell, very much like what you're writing about and deconstructing in the book.
Well, I was going to talk about power in relation to what Sheila was talking about in terms of myths being positive or negative. If we go back to what I said earlier about myths being sense-making mechanisms, what they do, what various mythologies, story narratives do, is they begin to tell a story that represents or reflects back to oneself their worldview. And the ability to do that is to wield a certain kind of power, especially when that worldview is very different from others. And so the reason I use that quote in the book is because the story of the Alamo that most of us learned, that I learned, was not a historical story, but a mythical story. And why do I say that? And in the book, I actually deconstruct the story that's told at the Alamo itself. That actually proved my point, is that most myths of this kind, as they are in reinforcing a worldview, have to tell a story with very little ambiguity. Mm-hmm. They have to be very direct in their message. And so many of these stories have binary structures, whether it's good and evil, or whatever it might be, however it plays out. And so the story of the Alamo that was told, the history that I learned when I went there, was very much a story of good and evil. It's a story of good Texans, bad Mexicans. And so myth has this way of either representing a particular worldview or rationalizing a particular worldview. And in this case, I talk about its rationalizing factor when it's created at that historical moment in the 1890s. And so to be able to have your worldview take place and order society is a kind of power. And so that's why I think it's very tied into what you were saying. And that's why these things are very powerful. Just very quickly, if myth is very binary or it leaves little ambiguity, what is history? History is actually boring, to be honest. The definition I use of history is chronology plus plot, okay? That is, it's a list of facts that get woven into a particular story. But because it is a list of facts that are woven into a story, there's certain evidence, and we can actually evaluate this as evidence. And we may disagree on the plot, but we have to look at the evidence to make sure it bears out. We have to be true to a certain kind of evidence, but we can tell that we can weave various kinds of stories around that evidence from various perspectives. And again, we can disagree about parts of that, but that's what history is about. Myth, on the other hand, tries to do away with that ambiguity and reinforce or rationalize a particular worldview, and that's why it's powerful.
PJ, this idea that that myth it sort of is spare and it simplifies things, I wonder if that's in part why, like, especially like Greek and Roman and Egyptian mythology is so attractive to kids. And again, like when my kids were reading these books, and then we read every single myth that we could, in every Greek gods and heroes story we could get our hands on. Is there something about those stories and their simplicity, perhaps, in certain ways that they're told, that is compelling to kids and that is useful to sort of build like a novel for kids around?
Well, I think for mythology, something that really stands out for kids is the fact that they learn these stories. Let's say I was in 6th grade. I think kids now are being introduced much younger because of the Percy Jackson books and books like, of course, Tut, The Story of My Immortal Life. That's just a small little pitch there for my book. Yeah. I haven't sold as many copies as Rick Riordan, sadly. Yeah. So anyway, it's the first time they're being introduced to these stories, and the fact of the matter is, a lot of kids have a rosy view of a lot of things. Their parents try to protect them from a lot of stuff, and now all of a sudden they're being introduced to stories about, gods killing each other and gods being jealous and the anger that's being portrayed, and yet it's kind of in the safe environment. Their parents are fine with them reading the stories. Their teachers are fine with them reading these stories. And that's kind of cool to them. They feel like maybe they're reading something they shouldn't be, but yet they are. And so maybe that's what draws them to it initially. I mean, I remember reading, I think my very favorite myth is the Cupid and Psyche myth. And I was like, wow, this story, it's like, there's jealousy, there's like murder, there's mean sisters, there's all sorts of stuff going on. And yet, I'd never heard it before. And I was like, how is that possible that I've never heard the story before? And so possibly that's what draws them to it, is that. And knowing that these stories have been passed down for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And they can read Mythology by Edith Hamilton, and then they can go read something else, and then they can go read something else, and they can see these cool tie-ins from other fiction books that are based on mythology, but it's kind of layered in there, and you have to be kind of smart to piece it out. And it makes them feel smart when they piece it out also, I would say.
It's funny that you mentioned the Cupid and Psyche myth, because when we were doing an audiobook and we listened to that one, and afterward I was like, how do we feel about what we just heard? Because there's some crazy stuff in that story.
I know. I'm still trying to figure out the way to bring that to the teen audience in a safe way. Maybe not. Maybe it's just for an adult story. I don't know. Yeah, so it should be a good one.
But I agree with you. I think that myth and fairy tale offer this great safe space. And there's a lot of argument that poetry and art do that too. You could say things in fiction or in poetry or in myth or fairy tale that you wouldn't say like at your Thanksgiving table directly, and everybody would be mad. But just if it's in a poetic, there's this great book called Veiled Sentiments by I'm going to forget her name. It's Layla somebody.
Abu Lagud.
Oh, I'm so
Lila-
happy
Lila
you know.
Abulagud.
I'm so impressed, Rich. That's
I'm an anthropologist. She's an anthropologist.
Yes, and it's this great book because she went and lived at she went and lived. I think you probably know. You could probably describe this book better than I can, but she talks about this kind of short poetic form they use in Bedouin society, and it basically is kind of a social safety valve because you're always having, especially women, they can't really express their feelings. Like your sister's being married to your true love and you can't say anything. But you can stand up and recite this poem that basically says exactly how you're feeling. And because it's in a form, everyone kind of claps and cheers, and it's a very important safety valve, which I think is important because we do try to protect our children. But our children, get jealous or angry, feel this, feel that. And myth, I think, and it's also full of cool details. I was going to say, one thing about telling a story where you have to speak to somebody and you have to get their attention and make them hear it, you're really struck by that when you read myths. They're pared down, but they're full of amazing details.
Children come to life through these stories, like E.T., for
Right.
example, and of course the Harry Potter stories and film versions and what. That in a way that adults can't reach them. Mm-hmm. What do you attribute that to?
Like that makes the kids so excited.
Yes.
I think a lot of it is, and I think it extends to the adult audience too. If you look at something like the Da Vinci Code or whatever, people love to feel smart. People really, and kids love to feel smart. And nothing makes a kid more excited than when they start talking to me and they can just geek out about like this subject about mythology or whatever it is, little, like the fine little details that you might not see anywhere else. And they're excited that somebody else has that interest also. And I think that's the thing that can really pull that out in kids and even in adults, as we see it.
Richard, I'd be curious what you think, but I think it's a lot about power. I think children feel powerless. Children feel very powerless. So do adults a lot of the time.
They're bullied frequently.
I was saying how fairy tales and myths often just describe what happened, but there's always a conflict that is very deeply about power. And I think also fairy tales are disturbing and also reassuring because they always do sort of present the idea that justice in some sense will be served, even if it's like horrible justice, like the bad person's going to get something dropped on their head and torn apart by wild horses or whatever. But and they're not always happy, but there's always this sense that justice is important, and that the powerless, they're almost like, go ahead.
But I also think, I think we adults do too. We don't like ambiguity. We like clear messages. We like, whether we agree with the message or not as a kid, but we know, okay, I do this is wrong, I do that, that's good. So that kind of affirmation, I think kids, even adults are looking for. We're always looking for that affirmation with our own worldviews. And I think even children are as well. But I also like there's something, when you were talking, I think there's something about, we have a fascination with danger. And I think playing around with these dangerous things, we're not going to get hurt by it, but we can play with it. And I think that's also something about it that's fun.
Helena, I wanted to ask you about Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, and then she also wrote the libretto for the Margaret Garner opera. And so Beloved it was sort of based on the Margaret Garner story, but it's like the character is not named Margaret Garner, and the story goes in quite a different direction than her real life. Her real life is the basis of that opera. They're incredibly different stories. But it was funny when I was reminding myself of like what happened in Beloved, I had forgotten that the end of the novel is in a way like positive and uplifting, whereas like when I think about the novel, I mean it's just like it's there's so many awful things in it. But then I know that Toni Morrison has said that she wanted the opera to be like this uplifting and positive experience, the way to sort of like begin to work through the institution of slavery, but like in terms of like what actually happens, I mean it's sort of unrelentingly awful.
It is. It's very tragic. She's so versatile, and the Margaret Garner novel, the Beloved novel, has Setha as, of course, the character that mimics the life, whose experiences mimic the life of the real Margaret Garner. Quickly, Morrison said she's no historian, and she wanted to address the issue of Margaret Garner from the unknown factor, but she could only do it through fiction, which is what she does best. And so it is a novel inspired by the Margaret Garner story. Part of it is because Margaret Garner was not allowed to, just a brief testimony she gave to say that she had been taken out of the state of Kentucky into Ohio, then she could have applied for freedom before that would have been before the fugitive slave law, et cetera. But otherwise, she killed her 18-month-old daughters, as the main plot line for the real Margaret Garner story, as well as the story of Setha in Beloved. But when Garner was put on trial for the murder, because she escaped with her family and children, but they were caught overnight in a house where an abolitionist family had put them up. And when the sheriff and her master broke into the house, or were in the process of breaking into the house, she killed the 18-month-old daughter and was in the process of trying to kill the other children by banging their heads with shovels and whatnot. And anyway, a long story short there, she managed to kill the daughter, the 18-month-old, but initially tried her or cited her for murder, but she wasn't a person, and they thought slavery itself would be put on trial. So they changed the circumstances so that she was tried for destruction of property. That's the daughter of the master. But this is what's even more complicated and strange about the situation. The daughter, by strong circumstantial evidence, was also the biological child of the master. And in the real story, the Pike's newspaper story of Ohio, which I have a copy of going back to 1856, he allegedly cried over this child's corpse, put her in a saddlebag, and went back across to Kentucky. Ohio Free State, Kentucky Slave State, buried her in an unknown place, even fueling even more the speculation that she was his child. It's too long to get into because Margaret was married, but when she was sold to this family, her husband was sent off to be hired out at a neighboring plantation. And then her children went from the two black children, sons, with her husband to biracial, to very, very fair, being, again, the children of her master. So Morrison could not straighten out the history of Margaret Garner. But as a mother of two sons, herself divorced, a single parent, starting her writing career, she knew that woman loved her children. Why did she do this? And so she wanted to write from the standpoint of the interior life of Margaret, of a mother, not a slave woman. So it really isn't a book about slavery. In Morrison's own words, slavery is peripheral to the story. It is there, no question. But it is about the mother being confronted by the ghostly return of the child. Is it ever accepted to kill a child for any reason, slavery or not? And Morrison is famous for saying what Margaret did. It was the right thing to do, but she had no right to do it. And that's the complication that's one reason the novel works so well, is it doesn't pretend to be, as you say, a story with a happy outcome or a story that tried to look for the brighter side of things. It confronts all the complexities, but the complexities of life issues. This happened, the novel is set after slavery. So Margaret Garner, Setha, is a free woman with her children. And she said when she moved into the house with her mother-in-law, she didn't know what to do with the first day of her freedom because she had never been allowed to decide. And so that, again, is what many slave narratives try to do. The controversy is rewriting history, but they're fictional, and they acknowledge that because we can't know what really happened to slaves whose lives weren't important, and many, it was illegal to even teach them to read in the first place. As we have a few narratives, good narratives like Frederick Douglass's, of course, and Harriet Jacobs, and Mary Prince was ghostwritten. So a work like Beloved then and other slave narratives have grown to be so popular because they reconstruct what, again, Morrison defines as the interior lives of the characters, showing that they had lives even apart from the horrors of slavery. They were people who loved, who hated, who had friends, who had enemies, and so forth. And so that's the takeoff for, I think, the way in which this novel approaches what we call history or biography in a fictional way.
I thought we would take a moment before our time runs out to open it up to questions from the audience. You all obviously don't have a mic, but I do. So if you call out your question, raise your hand, I'll call on you, and I'll repeat your question so that we can all hear it. Are there any questions in the audience?
I have a question.
Yes.
So in the reflection of, myths and religion, how some easy it happens that a myth will start being a religion and then it becomes a myth and vice if we fast forward 1,000 years, they, what we believe religion right now may be well seen as myths. I mean, I'm pretty agnostic, so.
Yeah,
And I see all of the religions like based on myths. And of course, Joseph Campbell, who's a great author about this, but why do we continue believing these things?
So what's the relationship between religion and myth? Because we've already referenced like Adam and Eve tonight. That's part of like a religion that people sort of like believe, and not in terms of like mythological reasons. And so, what's the connection?
I really want to know too. No, that was like one of the questions I had. I mean, you pull from like the Bible and you're pulling like creationism stories, and you do have people that believe it word for word, and you have people that believe it more in a mythical sense. And so is it wrong to take it and use it in a mythical way, or is it wrong to take a current religion that is being practiced today, like Hinduism or something like that, and use the gods from that in a mythological way? I want to know. Yeah.
Richard, in the book you talk about like the fact that like part of the Alamo is called hallowed ground, and it was a church, but it's like it was like the idea of hallowed ground has got kind of like religious context, and I wonder.
Well, let me answer this, and then I'll come back to that. I think people want to know who they are, where they come from, and I think these kinds of stories help answer those kinds of questions.
Well, I would argue that it doesn't answer, and it just helps like a palette, like something that will just give them like a space to feel some kind of comfort, but really don't go beyond that, being comfortable with truth.
Well, it's interesting, though, because if you go back to the turn of the century, and people like Baudelaire, who you wouldn't think of as very religious, right? And really wasn't. But that whole generation of early modernists were very concerned about what they saw as the death of God or religion becoming less important, because they thought, and I'm very agnostic myself, but they were afraid that without some sense of mystery or eternity or death as a real presence in life, these big questions, everything would become, they were very worried about capitalism making everything dull and materialistic, and people becoming less good or this or that. I mean, people, not that these were like saintly type people, but it's interesting how much they wrote about their concern about not that they liked religion, but the lack of a religious or spiritual dimension in life. They were and they thought that once, religion wasn't as prevalent, that sense of, like, I just read that essay from Walter Benjamin, who's a generation later, but very influenced by them. And he says, it's frightening that when we lose sense of eternity, we lose the sense of making huge efforts, like the kind of efforts that built cathedrals or something, or working together. And so there's a lot of, I'm just saying, I wonder, on the one hand, I agree with you, these stories logically do not accomplish anything, right? On the other hand, as a poet type person, the great poet John Keats said this really interesting thing. He was asked, I mean, Keats only lived to be 25, so everything he did, he had to do kind of as a young student. So he's walking along with this friend from medical school one day, and they say, what makes a great artist? And they're having this conversation, and Keats said, it's negative capability. It's the ability to rest in doubts and uncertainties without any irritable striving after fact or reason. And I think that's, to me, what myth and story is kind of about, that you always sort of, to stay alive in some ways. And he gave as an example Shakespeare always having such crazy stories where people do way worse things than you can imagine. Or Toni Morrison would be a great example of that. She's completely able to hold her story so that all those doubts and uncertainties play out.
Yes.
She doesn't try to control it too quickly. Right. Yeah. So I kind of feel like, I guess my answer would be, we need some element of that.
Yeah. We need to know that our life has purpose, and somehow that gives it purpose. That if in fact this is all there is not good enough for some people. that they need something more to attach to. Right or wrong, I mean, I'm not trying to lay judgment here, but that's how these things get created and reproduced. It's hard for us to look at the abyss and say, that's it.
Mm-hmm.
There was a question up here in the back.
Well, it was sort of an extension of that, but then also another question, sort of for PJ, but sort of for everybody. But it also, I think, depends on like how, like as a I grew up Catholic, and I know quite a few nuns who have been called heretics time and again because Catholicism is not viewed as properly Christian by a lot of people because we view the Bible as a moral compass and not as historical. And so there's like all kinds of craziness. But then you have people like Neil Gaiman who go in and like make it fabulous because he takes everything. He takes mythology and
Right.
religion from every part of the world and makes the most fantastic stories. And kind of going off of that, I was also going to extend to you like I know his big Norse mythology book just came out, and I didn't know like it's like PJ, that's perfect for like so much of what you do with these kids. It's like a big deal right now. Do you have any plans to look at that element of it? I know Greek myths were big for you, but what about
Like more. Oh, do you want to
Yeah.
repeat the question?
PJ, are you going to write some Norse myths?
Yeah, I'm gonna write
Yeah, I love taking mythologies and comparing them from around the world. So I have not specifically delved just into the Norse myth. I love the Egyptian mythology, and that's one that is not as well known. And what I think is cool is looking at things like the Isis and Horus myth and comparing it to the Madonna and Child, and seeing these reflections from the Judeo-Christian religion, or the Christian religion in that case, and the Egyptian and the Greek or the flood stories from around the world, and just comparing those and seeing how they all tie together. So I have not actually specifically done any Norse myth. One thing that I love, if we look at like the Judeo-Christian Bible, mythology, religion, whatever you might call it, is like the Indiana Jones. How there's this cool like mythology surrounding it, and yet there's this little like magical element, if you will, or this little bit of faith in there. And I think that's really cool. I think that's really well done. So.
We are almost out of time, and so I want to end with one final question for our panelists. And it's this: what are you working on now, or what can we look forward to seeing from you soon? Sheila, you want to go first?
Well, sure, because I'm always working on poems, and right now I actually just finished a book. It just came out like earlier this year. And so I'm kind of in that uneasy writer stage for everything you're writing. You're sort of giving yourself a holiday because you're like, well, I just had a book come out, I'm okay. And I'm just at that panic thing out where I'm like, oh, I have to start writing again, oh my God. I have to start, but I've been writing all these terrible poems. How am I going to put them together? That's what I'm working on.
I've finished a book on slave sites, which are external to museums, so not traditional museum artifacts or paintings, if you will. But an example would be what Toni Morrison regards as the bench by the road. They're basically steel park benches, but with the Morrison TMS, Toni Morrison Society logo emblazoned on the back. And they've been installed, there are 10, I think the 10th one, or am I getting all, how many, I get all confused, was installed outside of the Schomburg Center in New York this past summer. And Morrison, who's 86 and in a wheelchair now, but vibrant as ever, was there. She tries to attend these ceremonies. But it's actually, some are set in places where civil rights issues took place, like one near Money, Mississippi, where Emmett Till was murdered. But the first, and most of them, the first symbolic bench by the road actually was installed in, near Charleston. And one of my chapters deals with that entire region and the bench by the road in the context of the removal of the Confederate flag from the state capitol grounds. Because the flag was actually defined as a monument in legal less. And so the bench by the road then offers other ways that myths get created, because when people come to visit, tourists come to the site, they may each have their own ideas and memories about the past in their family history or tree or through historical events. And one more thing quickly is how that bench, being the first and being very symbolic, at Sullivan's Isle in South Carolina, is actually located at the site where over, I think it's more than 40% of all slaves brought into the U.S. actually came through that place. I didn't know that until I conducted the research.
We actually, my agent just sent out to editors a middle grade novel that I like to call Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure Meets the Odyssey, told through young Homer's point of view. And then I am now working on an adult novel that kind of is in the vein of the Iron Druid Chronicles. So.
And Richard.
Well, I've been working on memos. That is, I've been administrating way too long. I'm mastering the art of the memo. But before that, I have I have probably 3 projects that are about half completed each. One is sort of taking some of the ideas I used in the Alamo book and writing a book on Texas, that is the Mythologies of Texas, looking at other major sort of places, events, festivities, and sort of using the same kind of approach I did with that. The other, which actually PJ might be interested in, and it's still only about 2/3 done, when I would teach about the Alamo, students would always come to me and say, why do I have to wait to come to college to learn this? So I was working on taking that very thickly academic book you have over there and sort of writing it at a high school level. And it's about 2/3 done. But it's been about 2/3 done for about 5 years. So, PJ, maybe you could help me. So,
But it's a great idea.
anyway.
Please give our panelists a warm round of applause.
This has been the Writers League of Texas podcast. For more information about the Writers League of Texas and our many programs and services for writers, visit our website at writersleague.org. Email us at wlt@writersleague.org or give us a call at 512-499-8914. Thank you for listening.